establishment in 1977 of the Northrop Frye Chair in Literary Theory has played an important role in bringing to the university distinguished literary theorists of international standing, as one will expect of a position meant to honor the work of Professor Northrop Frye. Previous holders of the chair include Sandra Gilman, Paul Ricoeur, Hugh Kenner, Robert Wyman, Wolfgang Iser, Ralph Cohen, Edward Said, and Lee Kebal. In 1992, by the way, we're happy to be able to report that Professor V.V. Ivanov of the Institute of Linguistics of the Academy of Sciences in Moscow will hold the chair. And this year, the university is honored that Professor Barbara Herrnstein-Smith has joined the company of celebrated theorists. She's been offering a course this term on problems in the theory of value and judgment, axiology, and after. And we're delighted that she will be addressing the Department of English and University this afternoon. Professor Smith completed her PhD in English and American Literature at Brandeis University, and before taking her present position as Distinguished Professor of English at Duke University, she has taught at Bennington College and the University of Pennsylvania. In addition, she's held visiting appointments at the School of Criticism and Theory at University of California, Irvine, at Princeton University, where she has also been a member of the Institute for Advanced Study, at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. Excuse me. She has served as president of the Academy of Literary Studies and in 1988 as president of the Modern Language Association. Professor Smith's scholarly work we all know. Poetic Closure, a study of how poems end, in 1966 received the Christian Gauss Award for the most outstanding book of literary scholarship or criticism in that year. And in the same year, it received the Explicator Award for the best book of explication de text. In 1978, appeared on the Margins of Discourse, the relation of literature to language, and in 1988, Contingencies of Value, Alternative Perspectives for Critical Theory. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome her this afternoon. She will be speaking to us today on Living That Way, Quietism and the Active Relativist. Professor Smith.
So the title, Living That Way, Quietism and the Active Relativist. My remarks this afternoon are about living in the real world as a real relativist and about the widespread conviction that it's something that can't be done. These remarks are occasioned by objections raised to certain views of value and judgment that I've presented at talks and articles and also in the book just referred to, from which these remarks are adapted. At the core of the views of which I speak, and the focus of the objections of which I speak, is a conceptualization of value, all value without exception, as radically contingent, as, in other words, not a fixed intrinsic property of things, but rather a set of variable effects that are always a function of specific conditions and perspectives, and which therefore cannot be in any strict sense either objective or objectively determined. I'm recurrently informed that in rejecting the possibility of truly intrinsic value and truly objective value judgments, my work is quietistic, or as the latter term and associated objection are usually explained, that the positions prevent me from opposing bad things and promoting good ones. Anyone holding views such as mine, I am told, must look on bad things benignly as simply what the other fellow prefers, and on all things, good and bad, with passive, egalitarian tolerance. I should say that all of these things are in quotes, and as a matter of fact, the objections that I'm answering are those that have been raised in discussion sessions, such as the one that will perhaps follow this lecture. So all of these are indeed objections that have been raised. Whatever else you might say, I'm not dealing with a straw man, because that man usually appears 3 dimensions at least, and woman too. Anyway, so as a relativist, it is said, I must face the choice of being either morally and politically nerveless or logically inconsistent. Someone might develop such views in theory, it said, but no one can hold them in practice. No one, I am told, can live that way. Since these charges have considerable currency, and I'm certainly not the only target of them, they must be given attention. For reasons that touch on the heart of the matter, however, they cannot be quite refuted. For a central part of what's at issue here is the viability of the very terms in which such charges are framed, and indeed the viability of the entire system of conceptions and attendant conceptual syntax by which they're generated. Objections registered by orthodox objectivists to the views of value that I've developed and to my presumed political and moral life do indeed hinge on clashes of theory and practice. What clashes with my theory, however, is their objectivist theory, and what clashes with my practice is their objectivist description of my theory. To explain how this operates, and also to keep the scope of these remarks broad, I'll consider the Quietist objection in relation to the more general charge of relativism. First, however, a brief word about two terms that will recur in the discussion, namely objectivism and axiology. By objectivism, I mean the idea that there are certain types of value, notably aesthetic value and moral value, that are inherent in particular objects or practices, that such inherent or intrinsic value is unaffected by historical, cultural, and contextual conditions, and that the existence and extent of such value in objects and practices can be determined and specified, at least ideally, independent of situations, interests, and perspectives of particular people. What I will be referring to, and when I speak of objectivism and the objectivist, that is what I will mean, someone who holds those positions and that position. What I'll be referring to as axiology is the systematic exposition of that set of ideas, for example, in formal aesthetics or ethical theory, coupled with attempts to justify the claims to objectivity of certain aesthetic or ethical judgments. It is, of course, objectivism and axiology in those senses with which I take issue in my work, which brings us back to relativism, or rather to the two relativisms that will concern us here. The first relativism is any more or less extensively theorized questioning, analysis, problematizing, critique of the key elements of traditional objectivist thought and its attendant axiological machinery. In that sense, my work is, of course, relativistic. I've just said it, but that's what it consists of, namely a questioning and critique. The second relativism is that questioning as it is perceived and interpreted by that which it questions. It is a relativism created, in other words, by traditional objectivism itself. Or it could be said, it is a phantom heresy dreamt by anxious orthodoxy under siege. In this second sense, my work is not and could not be relativistic. In particular, it does not exhibit the set of foolish positions, convictions, and claims produced by objectivist thought when confronted with a questioning of its own conceptualizations of the world. It imagines itself turned upside down. This is not to say that no one holds the foolish positions or makes the foolish claims in question. There certainly are such people, including some who may refer to themselves as relativists, and who are, it appears, objectivists standing on their heads. It is to say, rather, that those positions and claims cannot be derived from the analyses and formulations developed in my work, except by the exercise of the very objectivist logic that my work questions and rejects. But of course, it is precisely those products of generation by self-inversion that one must deal with. That is, the charges so dependably leveled by orthodox objectivists and those whom they have instructed against those who reject objectivist formulations. The most central, classic, and perhaps enduring of these charges are the following. 1. Self-refutation. That is, the charge that in rejecting the objectivist notion of truth, one is necessarily asserting that all truth is relative, and thus it is said dissolving one's own claims to objective truth. The egalitarian fallacy, that's 2, is the charge that in denying the objectivity of value and thus objective validity of judgments, one is necessarily claiming that all objects are equally good, all practices equally justifiable, and all judgments equally valid. And 3, anything goes. That is the charge that in denying the possibility of objective descriptions and determinations of reality, one is necessarily claiming that reality is totally subjective, that there are no constraints on belief or behavior, and that people can think and do anything they like. So those are the 3 most classic and enduring charges against relativism. As I think is obvious, or maybe I used to think was obvious, as I would think might be obvious, but is obviously not obvious, the first 2 of these, that is self-refutationism and the egalitarian fallacy, are simply repetitions in reverse of the fundamental objectivist conceptions of truth, goodness, justification, and validity. In other words, if I'm told that I refute myself by not being able to claim any objective truth, I say, well, that's all right. I didn't say that I was claiming objective truth. I didn't say anybody else was either. It's all right with me if I don't claim objective truth, because objective truth is not anything that is bothering me particularly. I'll get back to that later. The egalitarian fallacy is a true non sequitur. It simply does not follow that in denying the objectivity of value that you are asserting that everything is equally valuable, that in denying the objective validity of statements you are asserting that everything is equally valid, because what you are doing is you are questioning in each case the term. So having questioned the term and that concept, you cannot be simultaneously saying that things are equally it, because you have just said that that it is what is questionable. These may seem like small logical problems. They, however, are uttered with enormous complacency as, well, we don't have to worry about your questioning of objective value because you are clearly a relativist, you clearly believe these foolish things. All I have to do with a snap of my finger is tell you that you have refuted yourself. I can leave now. Okay, I don't think it's that easy, or at least I hope it's not that easy. The third charge, anything goes, is the joint product of the traditional objectivist dichotomy of subject and object, so that if you question objectivity, you are heard to assert subjectivity, plus its attendant all or nothing logic, so that there are only those 2 alternatives, plus a related set of assumptions about the motives and constraints of human behavior that, as we'll see, are crucial to objectivist thought. In addition to these alleged beliefs or intellectual positions, a number of attitudes or dispositions are seen to follow from the questioning of orthodox subjectivism and are routinely identified with relativism. These include limp, lax, and indiscriminate tolerance, fatuous forbearance, the inability to exert evaluative authority. I'm often asked how I can bring up children since I obviously can't even tell them to pull up their socks, since I have no objective basis on which to do so. The refusal to recommend or criticize objects, practices, or ideas, the disinclination to take a stand or work for change, political and moral paralysis and despair, panglossism, and status quoism. Here, of course, is where the quietist objection proper finds its place. But before turning to it specifically, I want to add to this list of alleged positions and dispositions the further set of intellectual, social, and political calamities seen again by self-inversion to be the inevitable consequence of the critique of objectivist axiology, or, as it is said, to which relativism opens the gate. Namely, the loss of the authority of truth, facts, and logic, the disappearance of genuine science, moral reasoning, and rational discourse, the collapse of aesthetic standards, the eruption of social chaos and anarchy, the return to the jungle, the gulag, and the Nazi death camps. This is quite a bit to be accused of. No wonder, then, that the knees of even the strongest men and women buckle at such charges. In regard to these calamities, it should be noticed first that a number of them, for example, the loss of the authority of truth, or the disappearance of rational discourse, or the collapse of aesthetic standards, amount simply to a description of the world in the absence of the conceptual and discursive idiom of traditional axiology. These dread occurrences consist, in other words, not of the loss, disappearance, collapse, and breakdown of any practices and institutions, but rather the loss in some places for some of us, of the possibility of describing and accounting for various practices and institutions in familiar objectivist ways. Given the tendency of objectivist thought to reify theoretical constructs, truth, for example, it's not surprising that it regards the development of alternative conceptualizations of the world as an attack on fundamental entities. In other words, in questioning a certain conceptualization of truth, she denies, she rejects truth. All right? That's the equation. Since objectivist thought is unable by definition, that is, that's the definition of what the objectivist position is, to accommodate the idea of a world conceived otherwise, because that would just be already acknowledging the possibility of more than one way of describing it. But by definition, the objectivist thinks there is one way, the objective way to do it right. Since it can't conceive of there being alternative conceptions of the world, it concludes that in the absence of its own conceptualizations of the world, there could not be a world or any thought at all. Of course, not all the calamities that I mentioned a moment ago are merely alarmed descriptions of a world without orthodox descriptions of the world. In certain cases, notably the Gulag and the Nazi death camps, what sustains the idea that they are engendered by the questioning of objectivist thought, which is to say, engendered by relativism, is the intractably self-privileging logic of objectivist thought itself. Here, the conviction that only its own theoretical security, that is, only the belief in objective standards, intrinsic truth, and so forth, only its own theoretical security and widespread affirmation bar the gates of the polis and keep the night, the jungle, and the jackals at bay. That conviction obviously requires a specific and highly dubious socio-political theory, and with it a more general and equally dubious theory of the mechanisms, psychological, political, and other, by which human behavior is motivated and constrained. In other words, is it the belief in objective values and intrinsic truth, or objective truth and intrinsic value, that keeps the night, the jungle, and the jackals at bay? I don't think so. I think it's dubious because, among other reasons, it is evident that the jackals, the Gulag, and the death camps have not been kept from the polis, in spite of what has been, up to now, the theoretical dominance and widespread affirmation of objectivist thought. Now, in accord with what I described earlier as the quietist objection, the intellectual conflict that I've just outlined would be expected to produce in the relativist a condition of genial, torpid, philosophical que sera-sera-ism. Well, she might be expected to say it takes all kinds. Some like Nazis and objectivism, some don't. It's like chocolate and vanilla. Let's all go out and sit on the porch swing. What I want to suggest in what follows is that although that could happen, and perhaps under some conditions does happen, that is, sometimes she doesn't fight, there are specific reasons why and conditions under which the relativist will become quite active and energetic, both as a social and political agent and as a promoter and defender of various objects, practices, and ideas. I want to say parenthetically, because this becomes, interestingly enough, a question in itself, all through the book, there are various practices that one uses in order to avoid sexist pronouns. One is to say he, she. Another is to say she all the way through. The one that I use, which is fairly common, is to alternate. In some arguments, if I speak of speakers and listeners, I have the speaker he, the listener she. I speak of artists and scientists, and I have the artist she and the scientist he, and use those pronouns consistently. It's for clarity. In this particular section of the book, I always refer to the relativist as she, it being me, and the objectivist therefore becomes he. This is heard as a subterranean gender battle. It is not. If you want to ask later about the relation of gender to these positions, it's an interesting question, and it could be answered historically, but it is not my claim that the objectivist is a guy. Okay? We may note first, okay, so what I'm saying now is how it is that relativists, to everybody's amazement, actually get up, walk around, do things, and even fight sometimes. We may note first the idea crucial to all versions of the Quietist objection, that although a non-objectivist might undertake to do things, nevertheless, because she must believe that everybody has a right to his own perceptions and judgments, or she must believe that all the latter are equally valid, then she couldn't justify doing what she does, or she couldn't do them and be consistent. But as I've already indicated, what the non-objectivist allegedly must believe is something that she not only need not believe, but cannot believe. Contrary to the self-refutationist argument, an abandonment of objectivist conceptions of truth does not and hardly could oblige one to acknowledge that anything is or is not true in the objectivist sense. Nor, contrary to the egalitarian fallacy, could a denial of traditional conceptions of objective validity oblige one to regard other people's opinions, beliefs, and tastes and so forth as equally valid. Since the non-objectivist, by definition, doesn't conceptualize truth and validity the way an objectivist does, she can't give to true or valid the meanings those terms have for the objectivist, which are also the meanings that are required either for her position to be self-refuting or for her to be committed to that form of egalitarianism which to the objectivist defines relativism and entails quietism. In short, a non-objectivist, by definition, cannot be committed to what the objectivist objects to in what he names relativism, nor is she then behaving inconsistently when she acts in a way inconsistent with those alleged commitments. Okay? I never said that I believe those things. You cannot show me logically that those things are entailed by what I have said. So if you tell me that what I do is inconsistent with it, so it's inconsistent with your notion of what follows from what I say. It's inconsistent of what you have heard me say. I haven't said it. Various versions and key variants of the Quietist objection can be considered accordingly. One of them concerns what the relativist allegedly can and cannot say, the way her verbal behavior is allegedly muted by her alleged commitments. It's sometimes argued, for example, that one cannot live as a non-objectivist. Okay, so the idea is that there are certain things that you can't, but if you believe that, you can't say X, okay. Sometimes argue that one cannot live as a non-objectivist because in the real world of real peasants, politicians, and police, one must deal with people for whom only objectivist-type considerations and justifications, only appeals to universal standards, objective facts, and fundamental rights, and not just to contingent preferences and local beliefs, will be acceptable and effective. Okay, so the idea is, it's all right for you to believe that in theory, but when you actually go out and have to fight for something, a cause, or oppose something, you better be able to say objective fact, universal standard, fundamental right, or else, you're without resources. I say two answers. One, the second one is the one that matters most, but I think the first should be put in place anyway. The first is that because the lexicon, the syntax, the register of all discourses are always constrained by and accommodated to the particular features of a communicative situation, it would be no more logically inconsistent for a non-objectivist to speak under some conditions of fundamental rights and objective facts than for a Hungarian ordering his lunch in Paris to speak French. Okay? So in other words, you can use whatever language you think is effective. Correct? And the logician is there to say, but you've just contradicted yourself. Okay? Then I can go back to my second objection. I emphasize, by the way, under some conditions, because what we're discussing here is relativism and non-objectivism, are of course formally articulated accounts and critiques, which as such are most commonly played out not in interactions with police, peasants, and politicians, but rather in arenas of theoretical discourse and exchange. This is not to say that these views have no implications in other domains. It is to say rather that these implications do not require the formal recitation of formal theories, or in the name of some altogether pedantic and irrelevant consistency, the earnest substitution of technical terms for idiomatic ones. But that's only the first answer. The second, and for me more important reply to this argument, is that we should not underestimate in advance the power, richness, subtlety, and rhetorical effectiveness of a non-objectivist idiom. That is, forceful recommendations of objects and practices that do not insist on their intrinsic value. Justifications of political actions that do cite current conditions and likely outcomes rather than natural rights and eternal truths. The effectiveness of a non-objectivist idiom cannot be gauged by those who have never learned to speak it and have thus never tried to use it in interactions with, among others, real policemen, real peasants, and real politicians. Also, I might say, real children, because they did pull up their socks and do all kinds of other very desirable things, though I never claimed intrinsic value or objective truth for any of the things that I said. Another version of the Quietist objection is commonly argued in relation to various forms of pedagogy and instruction, including institutional teaching, academic literary criticism, domestic child rearing, and missionary work. In this version, it's claimed that a non-objectivist conception of value, especially the idea that value is always seen and measured from some perspective, must commit one to the view that people cannot or should not evaluate for other people, to the view that it would be wrong, for example, to remark with regard to some object or practice such as Shakespeare's poetry, or the concealment of the genitals in public, or the study of Old Norse. It would be wrong to remark a value that other people hadn't remarked for themselves, or evidently considered quite differently. The Quietist objection also maintains that non-objectivist conceptions of value commit one to the view that parents, teachers, and missionaries cannot or should not urge the notice of those unappreciated objects or practices on children, students, and various other persons understood to be immature, benighted, or misled as to their true interests and desires by their upbringing, their cultures, or the mass media. You understand the idea is that here everybody is surrounded by various forms of immaturity and false consciousness, and everybody is duped, but you are prevented from recommending something because, well, it's just their opinion. Who am I to say anything? Okay, that's the notion. For it will be typically argued here that even though the object or practice in question may appear undesirable or disagreeable from the perspective of these latter persons, that is, the natives or the children or the students, it might nevertheless be the case that it was really, essentially, intrinsically, objectively good. Or that even though those persons didn't yet realize it, the object or practice would perform fundamentally beneficial and ultimately desirable functions for them. For example, edifying, economic, therapeutic, or salvational ones. It should be clear, however, that this version of the Quietist objection presupposes the entire axiological machinery that the non-objectivist problematizes, and thus, again, begs all the crucial questions at issue. Those questions are, first, whether something's being really good or really bad. I must note parenthetically that value in all of these instances can be disvalue, and that frequently is cited along with the unappreciated objective goodness of reading Shakespeare's poetry or studying ancient languages is the unrecognized objective badness of wife-beating, bride-burning, clitoridectomy, and watching television crime dramas. The added piquancy of examples in which the victims are female can hardly be missed. What? You're going to say that everything's all right, clitoridectomy too? All right, so this is going to be the shape, and that you can't argue against it because that's just what they happen to believe. Okay, to return, however, to the begged questions. The first is whether something's being really good or really bad could be determined from no perspective whatsoever, or whether we don't have in such cases a particular other perspective that is masking itself as no perspective, which is to say, tacitly privileging itself. Second, whether it could be from no perspective or only from some particular other perspective that the alleged fundamental benefits would be counted as fundamentally beneficial. And third, whether the pedagogic version of the Quietist objection doesn't therefore back up towards and slip irrevocably into the familiar infinite regress of all axiological claims, which is to justify the judgment and then to justify the justification of the judgment. In other words, at every point you can say, yeah, that's really good on what basis, but what gives that basis a basis, and what gives that judgment of that basis a basis? That's the infinite regress. Infinite regresses are not necessarily bad, okay? I do believe that infinite regresses that are theoretical stop. I usually say, if somebody says to me, well, if you take that to its logical conclusion, ... I always say, I never take anything to its logical conclusion. I stop when I'm ahead. But we want to deal with these worries, these very practical, political, as well as pedagogic and theological, in a sense, worries. But I'm still noting the questions that are begged with the notion that one can't object. Because what I'm going to say is that one can object. One can object, one can make recommendations, one can make all kinds of suggestions, and one can operate not only verbally but in other ways quite strongly. So what I'm going to say is that the notion that one can't object is what's wrong. But I'm still showing how the very idea that one can't is begging the question. For the real goodness seen by the parent, teacher, or missionary could not be self-evident, can't be self-evidently good, or it already would have been evident to the children, students, or benighted natives who failed to see it. And any attempt to justify those alternative judgments would also have to justify the privilege accorded to the alternative perspective from which they were made. My claim is that if you make a judgment, you make it from a perspective. If you claim that you're not making it from a perspective, you're making it from a perspective and simply denying responsibility from the perspective from which you're making it. None of this is to say, I have this in double italics and in caps. None of this is to say, and I cannot emphasize this strongly enough, none of this is to say that one should not point out some otherwise unnoticed contingent goodness or badness to one's students, children, and other people, or urge it upon them. Nor is it to say that the privilege of one's perspective could not be defended. I say to you privileged with problems that you're privileging tacitly, not acknowledging that you're privileging. When I tell my daughter to pull up her socks, she now is old enough to do it quite well herself, but when I told her, you say, well, why? Who are you? Why? I said, I'm older, I'm taller, I'm richer. Any number of things. In other words, you can justify the privilege that you give to your perspective. This is, of course, an amusing example, but it could be extended into all of the usual political and ethical examples of greater consequence. What I am saying, rather, is that since the contingency of value cannot be evaded, whoever does that urging cannot ultimately suppress or ultimately evade taking responsibility for the particularity of the perspective from which he or she does so. The point is not to back up into the underwriting of your perspective as the objective perspective. As far as I can see, that is an oppressive act, and it will usually be reacted to as an oppressive act. And I think that the alternative, which is to say, yeah, I'm telling it to you because stick with me, you'll be wearing diamonds. Have I ever given you a bum steer? I've seen it happen this way. If you look at the consequences, this is the way it might turn out. Why not that? Why not that? And again, elaborated as necessary. I'll talk about the elaboration now in a second. The rejoinder typically entered at this point is that if a judgment is particular and partial, it cannot be justified. This conclusion follows inevitably from the objectivist conception of justification as a structure of objective in the sense of impersonal argumentation built on objective in the sense of empirical or transcendental foundations. It is possible, however, for the social, political, and communicative dynamics of verbal or other overt judgments, and accordingly the structure and operation of their justification, to be reconceived along other lines. Specifically, and within the particular domain of instruction and pedagogy, our justifying a particular judgment. What do you have to read this for? Or how come you don't put this on the list? People often say to me, you're a relativist. Can you ever draw up a reading list? How can you ever get your students to read anything since you don't think that anything has any objective value? It's amazing, all of these years, I have gotten students to read things, even here at Toronto. And I do it by saying, well, what do you think I do? Do you think I do anything different from what anybody else does? I say, it'll be good for you to know it. It's going to be on the test. Whatever. These are the reasons. It's part of the subject matter. If you took the course, presumably you want to know something about it. Those are the reasons. Do I have to claim intrinsic value? I don't see why. Anyway, specifically, but this is the reconception of justification that I want to mention. Specifically, within the particular domain of instruction and pedagogy, justifying a particular judgment to those whose welfare is our responsibility and over whom we have social, political, and or institutional power, as parents, as teachers, and so forth, may be seen as our making as explicit as necessary to them the various conditions that produced our judgment and our consequent recommendation or prohibition or requirement. This is a process that would have as its built-in stopping place not the point at which the explication hit objective rock bottom, for on this view there is no such point, but rather the point at which it turned the trick. That is, when the explication of considerations secured their acquiescence. Oh yeah, right, okay, sure. Of course, it could happen that it didn't turn the trick. All right. What do you mean I need it? I need to pull up my socks, but who says that, why? I say, well, you'll be cold. Well, I don't care about being cold. Why? You can have continued resistance even to the fact that you are giving reasons for the recommendation, because the reasons may not count as reasons, so you then have to continue this, again, potential infinite regress. The question is always going to be, where will it stop? If it doesn't stop when they say, okay, then how will it stop? It could happen that it didn't turn the trick, and seemed never likely to do so, in which case some other form of enlightenment and persuasion might seem called for. Bribes or threats, for example, or it might be physical force. If and when recourse was had to these alternatives, especially the last, might will not, of course, have made right, at least not from the relativist's point of view, for which nothing makes right in that sense, but might will certainly have been exercised, and it may be granted that someone who conceived of all value as radically contingent might very well, in dealing with those subordinate to her, be edged toward this last violent alternative less readily than the absolutist objectivist. In other words, I'm conceding the quietist objectivist. It could be that someone who had such views just might not be pushed quite so quickly to knocking somebody down when they resisted both the persuasion and the analysis and the explication and the bribes and the other sweeteners. They still were resisting, all right? It may be that our relativist here might be edged toward this last violent alternative less readily than the absolutist objectivist. Not, however, because her relativism made her nicer or tamer or quieter, but because she would have more alternative forms of action available to her because of the way in which she framed the nature of value. In other words, there would be more ways, more reasons to give, more understandings, more forms of negotiation, because she wouldn't say, this is right, you're wrong, you don't accept, I've done everything I can, it is now time to take out the gun. In other words, the gun remains, in the closet for longer, on the shelf for longer. There seems, however, to be a further subsidiary anxiety in the pedagogic variant of the quietist objection. Though not usually given in such terms, it's the fear that somebody's acknowledging the fact and partiality of her perspective, let's say as a teacher, would make her authority, that is precisely the privilege of her perspective, vulnerable. And indeed, while such an acknowledgement would not necessarily undermine someone's authority over her students, children, or native parishioners, it might make it more subject to their interrogation. So you're not claiming absolutely, you didn't hear it directly from God, it wasn't built into, your commission with with this group and so forth. All right, then just exactly where do you come off telling us these things? Okay, so it would subject it to interrogation. And if her authority was not otherwise sustained for them, sustained, for example, by what they acknowledged, what they might very well acknowledge as her wider experience, shrewder calculating ability, access to better sources of knowledge, or demonstrably, for whatever reason, concern for their welfare, then her authority would be put at risk. But the securing of authority from interrogation and risk can hardly be thought to be an unqualified or unconditional good. On the contrary, it might be thought that there was some communal value to ensuring that authority was always subject to interrogation and always at risk. All authority, which must mean that of the parent, teacher, and missionary, as well as that of the tyrant, pope, and state flunky. I've spoken of what does not follow, of alleged claims the non-objectivist does not make, alleged positions she does not occupy, alleged convictions she does not hold. So what does follow? What in particular may one expect a relativist to do as a socio-political, or as it is said, moral or ethical agent? The answer in the first instance must continue to be negative or at least undramatic, for I must insist that given only that denial or questioning of objectivism which is sufficient to evoke the quietist objection, no particular moral positions or types or modes of political action follow from it at all. Neither those typically attributed to relativism, such as liberalism, egalitarian tolerance, and passivity, or any others. The answer to the question of what follows, then, cannot be a description and celebration of what relativists per se characteristically do as moral and political agents, but only that various forms and modes of action are altogether consistent with the denial and questioning of objectivism, including those forms and modes commonly said to be logically excluded or psychologically disabled by it. So I'm not saying once you're a relativist you'll do all these good things. All I'm saying is that if you're a relativist, it's not impossible for you to do all of these things. All right? It's a different shape. It is not excluded. You think that if I'm a relativist I can't go out and do this. I'm not saying I guarantee that being a relativist I will. What I'm saying is that being a relativist won't prevent me from doing it. That won't be, something else might, but it won't be that. Someone's distaste for notions such as absolute value and objective truth. I say taste, but in the book taste is a very strong concept. So it's not mere taste. For me, if you like, all judgment is taste, and therefore it's not mere taste as opposed to reasoned judgment, because reasoned judgment, since reasoning is also, from a perspective, is also taste. So if I say it's not to her taste, it's not to trivialize the preference. Someone's distaste for notions such as absolute value and objective truth does not in itself deprive her of such other human characteristics relevant to moral political action as memory, imagination, early training and example, conditioned loyalties, instinctive sympathies, antipathies, and so forth. Nor does it deprive her of interest in the subtler, more diffuse, and longer-range consequences of her actions and the actions of others. Nor does it oblige her to be motivated only by immediate self-interest. What sustains common views to the contrary here is, of course, the traditional idea that the only thing that prevents people from behaving like beasts or automatons is their being leashed by or to some transcendental or otherwise absolute authority. Accordingly, what could refute such views would not be a roll call of selfless and visionary relativists, for such a list would only be recited by objectivists as proof that no one can live that way. The only thing that could refute it would be the development and widespread appropriation of alternative, non-objectivist accounts of the dynamics of human choice and action. I don't undertake that project here, but my conception of its most profitable directions will be clear in what follows. In other words, the notion is that if you don't like objective truth, okay, then you just cannot do all these other things. My point is that what makes you think that it was liking objective truth that kept you doing those things? Maybe we do not understand the nature of motivation and also the nature of constraint. And maybe that's where we should start our explorations, is with an alternative understanding of human motivation, social constraints, action. Someone's abandonment of the notion of absolute value does not per se deprive her of morally relevant characteristics, but neither does it endow her with any, which is why I say I can't promise you that I will go out and fight your fight if I'm a relativist. All I'm saying is that being a relativist will not prevent me from fighting your fight with you. Indeed, a relativist in that sense could very well be a moral monster. Resentful, self-absorbed, vengeful, stupid, lazy, and in all technical and idiomatic senses, irrational creature, as of course all other people are from time to time, including, it seems, objectivists, but we let that pass. To ask what could prevent such a person, that is a person who had a distaste for the idea of absolute value, that's our definition here. That's all we're saying about it. By definition, the non-objectivist is simply denying the notion of objective value. All right, to ask what could prevent such a person from wreaking social havoc, since by definition her actions are not governed by absolute moral constraints, is of course another version of if God is dead, everything is permitted. And as I'll indicate in a moment, the reply to both is the same. First, however, I would grant and indeed insist that perhaps nothing could, would, or will prevent it. That is, I think that individual relativists may very well behave like the careless, cynical, vicious amoralists of history and literature. And that secular society, or any chunk of it you like, post-Reformation society, American consumer society, late capitalist post-industrial society, and so forth, may very well be caught up in socio-pathological patterns of action that will conclude with some total apocalypse or universal extinction. There's nothing in the post-axiological views of human judgment and action represented in my work that can exclude such possibilities, no guarantees. To the extent that anything did prevent such individual amoralism or social havoc, however, it would be the same things that have always made some actions and patterns of action, if not impermissible, then at least highly unlikely. And that, I think, is as good as we can get. Highly unlikely, not impermissible. It's not that somebody forbade it, but through an analysis one can see that it is not likely to happen. But I continue here. Among the most important of those things, constraints, if you like, though the term I think is misleading in this connection, are the innumerable, subtly, continuously operating, usually unrecognized, but nevertheless strong behavioral tendencies, likely to do or not do, that emerge from individual and social practices themselves. These tendencies are not, as terms such as rules, norms, standards, and constraints suggest, external forces that operate upon agents to direct or control their actions, but are rather the recurrent inclinations of the agents themselves, inclinations to act in certain ways rather than others, that are the corporeally inscribed traces of the differential consequences of their own prior and ongoing actions and interactions. All right? It is through our practices, through our dealing with the universe and with one another. Some things work better than others. Some things work very, very badly. The patterns of these are our inclinations. What constrains us, if you like, what makes us do one thing rather than another, is, if you want, the fact that some worked out better, some were more profitable. This then has to enter into a larger structure of profits in relation to the community. But I think that the same thing will operate at the communal level. So we don't have here an opposition between individual and community. In addition to these more or less recurrent patterns and inclinations, what prevents individual relativists and whole societies of pagans from running amok is the tendency and power of social groups to channel the practices of its members through various more or less formal and institutionalized sanctions, which also operate on agents as differential consequences of their own actions. The tendencies of social groups to do this is not annihilated, nor is their power to do so crippled or even diminished by the refusal of some or indeed many of the members of the group to grant the alleged intrinsic value of those practices, or to grant the alleged objectively or theologically grounded legitimacy of those sanctions. I don't need to have the sanctions that operate on me as laws or as ethical imperatives or shunnings or approvals. In other words, it could be at the legal level or at the more social level. I don't need to think that they are objectively grounded or come from God in order to have them operate on me. Whether as individually conditioned personal inclinations, then, or as communally rewarded or punished social behavior, the feedback loop of differential consequences is sufficient to prevent our actions from being just anything which is, of course, why it's never the case that anything goes, even if God is dead or no one believes in absolute standards anymore. Let me repeat that so that you get the precise point that I'm making. Individually conditioned personal inclinations or communally rewarded punished social behavior, the feedback loop of differential consequences is sufficient, not sufficient to prevent our being bad. I'm not saying sufficient. After all, we don't have to worry about people being bad because it's just going to all work out all right. I'm not saying that it's sufficient to prevent us all from being bad. What I'm saying is that it's sufficient to prevent it from being just anything. The point what I'm arguing against is the notion that if God is dead, everything is permitted. There are other reasons why things aren't permitted, all right? And that if you don't believe in absolute constraints, then you think anything goes. And what I'm saying, it is never the case that anything goes, because there are other kinds of dynamics, social, individual, psychological, that are operating to incline one to do one thing rather than another. Doesn't guarantee goodness, but it certainly does say don't expect anything. There will be something. The relativist, like anyone else, often finds that other people's beliefs, interests... If you're looking for a guarantee of virtue here, I'm not going to give you a recipe for it. All right? What I'm trying to protest, or at least prevent, is the notion that there are certain forms of catastrophe and viciousness that necessarily follow from a certain kind of questioning. I do not turn this around and say, listen to me, kids, and the world will then turn out to be fine, or follow right along behind me, and all will be well. That is not my point. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done to make things better, okay? And that's more or less the terms in which I'm inclined to put it. The relativist, like anyone else, often finds that other people's beliefs, interests, desires, preferences, and judgments are more or less different from hers. This does not, however, paralyze her will or leave her in frozen quandaries, unable to resist Nazis or to march in support of abortion rights, all right? Since she also continuously finds other differences that are crucial for her social and political choices and actions. All right, I'm saying, yeah, the other guy doesn't think the same way as I do, but that doesn't make me stop acting, because there are other differences, all right, that do make me act. For example, different stakes involved and different resources available to change things, or for that matter, to preserve or restore them. The relativist social and political choices and actions are compelled then, and in effect her stands are given a base by the specific contingent conditions in which she operates as an agent, as she perceives, interprets, and considers those conditions, or in short, how she evaluates them. So evaluation now comes to the fore as a very, very important activity. So I will stress that.
Sorry.
You want me to stop?
No, it's okay. You can go on. I'll just...
Insofar as the now, all right, so I've been talking about how the